Hello, everybody. Our conversation today will be about vitrification. We will be talking with our guest expert, one of the world-renowned embryologists from Chicago, Illinois, Dr. Juergen Liebermann. Dr. Liebermann has been working in the field of IVF since 1995. He is the director of laboratory services at the Chicago-based fertility centers of Illinois, partners with with US Fertility, Ovation, RMA New York network. He received his doctoral degree from the Technical University of Munich in Bavaria, Germany in 1995. And his postdoctoral thesis in 2004 qualified him as a university lecturer in experimental reproductive medicine at the Bavarian University of Würzburg, Germany. He contributed more than 180 oral presentations at national and international meetings and has authored more than 68 peer-reviewed publications, book chapters, and 66 abstracts in reproductive science. In 2007 and 2016, he co-authored a book with Dr. Michael Tucker titled Vitrification in Human-Assisted Reproduction. He is a member of ASRM, ASHRE, and ABB. He also serves as an ad hoc reviewer for Fertility Sterility, Human Reproduction, RBM Online, and several other magazines. He holds diploma of honorary international member of CECOL-FES, Bogota, Colombia, in 2013 and 2017. Dr. Liebermann is married and proud dad of 5 children, ages 11 to 21. He is also a marathon and triathlon finisher, mountaineer, scuba diver, and this last one, which took me a moment to understand, he is equestrian. I hope you know what it is. He loves horses, right? So it's a horseback riding.
Yes.
Dr. Liebermann, Juergen, thank you very much for accepting my invitation to this interview.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor, Dmitry, and I'm very happy to be here.
Fantastic. So let me ask you the first question. Please tell us when and why you became interested in vitrification.
So I have to start with that 2025 actually marks 30 years of being in that field. So I started in 95, and I had my first job was as a technician and as an embryologist until 2004. I took on a directorship at University in Würzburg in Germany in 96 to 2004. And in the meantime, in between, I actually took a sabbatical leave to see other countries and how they perform IVF. Germany has an embryo protection law and a lot of restrictions in terms of dealing with embryos and treating patients with infertility. So I built connections to the United States. A good friend, a longtime friend of myself, Michael Tucker, made it possible that I joined Shady Grove in 2000. And that's where we actually combined starting looking into vitrification. And, I was not aware what actually vitrification was out there already for 4 or 5 years, because if you look at previous publications by, for example, Gabo Weider from Denmark, he was at that time in Denmark, he did vitrification very successfully on bovine and pigs. But, it didn't transform to the human IVF. So it was something new. And so I started in 2000 really at the basics, how we can successfully vitrify oocytes and embryos. And there was no solutions, there was no carrier. So everything we started actually from the scratch.
Okay. Can you tell us about the time, kind of sort of stage, when you realized that vitrification, which you are just learning or maybe just learned, actually can be and must be improved?
So, when we implemented vitrification in 2004, and, that was a time where I started my position here in Chicago, we never actually opened up the boxes with the slow freezing machines. we bought 2 slow freezers. We never opened them because we decided let's do vitrification. And we started with embryos, not with oocytes, but pretty much after embryos, we started with oocytes 2005. And so we established protocols. They were very successful. They were successful. But I remember very well that people struggled to move on from slow freezing to vitrification. And slow freezing, it worked very well for blastocysts. We had excellent outcomes. For oocytes, it was not very successful, right? It was done for many years in a very well-known institution in Italy, in Bologna, by Dr. Eleonora Porcu, and she was like the person who had the most live births from frozen oocytes. But it took her like 25 years to get to a certain number of live births. It's not anymore comparable to today. And I remember those resistancy, and we are in a field where people not taking easy changes or new approaches, so it's very conservative. But I always was open for new one because I knew there is always space for improvement. And for vitrification, even it was successful, the hardest part for people transitioning to vitrification, even it was more successful, was the kind of time they had to perform this. For example, people were like really concerned about freezing eggs to like 16 minutes, sitting on the bench and freezing eggs for 15 minutes exposure to the first solution and then to the final solution for 1 minute. So it would be 16 minutes. Because when you froze slow, you just prepared them and put them in your machine and you walked away. For example, I froze zygotes for many years and they were like frozen in 98 minutes. And 99% of this was done by a machine. So you had to load the machine and you went back just to remove them from the machine. But now people had to sit there for 16 minutes freezing oocytes. And that was a concern for a lot of people. Even the results, they were coming in like monthly by publications. They definitely showed improvement in terms of survival, and finally, with the survival, their ability to culture to excellent embryos and to make live births, right? So we established protocols over years where we were very consistent. And it is very interesting that we actually developed these vitrification techniques, because today it would be impossible to think about if we wouldn't have them. Because in these 20 years of vitrification, what increased dramatically was the number of frozen cycles. If it's frozen embryos, frozen oocytes, and of course, with biopsy, we even froze more embryos. So it was the right tool at the right time to have these very convenient and fast and efficient techniques to vitrify or for embryos or blastocysts and oocytes. Then, coming back to your initial question, Dmitry, what drove me to the changes? And I have to tell you, there is always people out there besides me they look into this. And one is a good friend of mine, Teal Tyler, and he found in his lab that 1 minute is very sufficient to warm blastocysts. And he made successful prize papers at PCRS, and he did it at ASRM. But I picked it up, right? This is a situation I just not passed by. I took it and I went home and I did my own validation. And everyone should do this. When you make changes in your lab, there is always first the information, and when you feel as the information, is it useful? Do you think it's worthwhile to look into? And then you make your own validation, right? Never rely on data, especially where we're not published, right? If you have published papers, peer review, it's a different scenario. And so we started in-house following like over the next 6-7 months in 2022 in May, about 600 embryos. And we saw, based on that 24 embryo development, that this 1 minute for was excellent. It was sufficient to make them with a high survival, but more important, keeping their potential to develop after 24 hours in the dish overnight to full expanding blastocysts and even to hatching on their own.
Well, thank you. Now, before you started to improve the protocol, what gave you the confidence that you can do it? We know that protocols improvement is the hardest thing in our profession, and it doesn't always come with a good outcome, even after sometimes years of trying, because
Right.
in many ways it's empirical. But what gave you confidence that it may be worthwhile effort for you, uh, that you have a decent chance of success in improving it?
Right. So first of all, it is my years of experience, right? I'm not running blind in something I have no clue or no experience. When I would focus on the situation, I would gather information and try to get experience, and then I would make a judgment. So I'm always very positive to everything new. I'm very open to changes, and that's the first thing you have to have. It's a kind of talent, maybe not everyone has that, and that's okay. My task is actually to convince other people to be more positive and more proactive to changes. When you do the validation and you saw, how these embryos looked like, there was, I started with 50 blastocysts. I did it with a senior embryologist of my team. And I said, I want to have 20 more. We went to 70. On the end, we ended up with 16. It's maybe too much, but sometimes there is certain things you cannot overkill. I want to have a strong end number, and in the end number is a power, right? And if you have 50 blastocysts or 600, there's a different information. Even on the end, you get the same outcome, but with 600, this is the right way to go. And based on this, I presented that to our physicians. This is what we saw over the 6 months when we fought with 600 embryos, and I would propose to make a change to our thawing protocol. And our physician said, Jürgen, you have these numbers and we trust you, and they look okay, so we have no problem. And since then, we see a consistency in outcome. I would say we see even improvement. And as you may be aware, I posted that stuff very early on LinkedIn to make it transparent, to give access to a broader public, because we can just live on that when other people pick it up and we get additional opinions. And that's where I see my contribution in that part, not the initial findings on that, but then taking it on to a challenge and then present it to the embryology society and community, and encourage people to look into this and also provide additional data. And I can tell you now, I get so many responses just recently. I know I would love to read it from my phone, but I can also have it in my mind, that a person approached me and told me, since we implemented this fast warming, our outcome improved, and thankful very much. It's just a powerful tool. And we are, as a big program, as I mentioned before, with all these biopsies we do, and now having FETs on a daily basis of 10 to 15, it is a huge time saver when you talk about this number of FETs in terms of thawing 1 minute compared to like 9 minutes, right? So you save not just time, you save stuff, and it is very important, to save stuff, because when you can save stuff for other tasks, and you can spread workload out to other people. So we have usually one embryologist on a daily basis taking care of all these 10 or 15 FETs. That person starts at 7 o'clock, and all these embryos are thawed at 9 o'clock. So are we ready to go when the retrievals are done? We are ready for the FETs. Sometimes we do FETs in between retrievals, because it's like 25, 26 procedures just to get the day done in an efficient way, and not tracking people over endless hours here. That is important too. So there is a lot of benefits when we look at this fast warming protocol. It is time saving, it is efficient, it gives you the same outcome. I would say even it gives you more consistent, higher outcome. But more important also, it's a simplification of a protocol. And we have more people entering this field. We need more embryologists. And I think even we do very sophisticated work, it's important to make the protocols not more complicated and difficult as they are. So if we get new embryologists, it is even faster for them to learn this very simple way for freezing as well as for warming. It's an important key factor.
Thank you. Now, can you please take us through your protocol step by step to kind of disclose in a nutshell what is unique about the way you do this vitrification?
So, of course, first of all, I have to start when we look at the outcome of FETs. And we talk about day 5, day 6, and even day 7 blastocysts. So we talk about an advanced stage of human embryo development. Outcome in FETs is one thing, but your foundation is in your culture system, right? We don't make embryos better because we now form them faster. So everything is in your culture system. It starts with the retrieval. Of course, it starts with the physician part in terms of stimulation. It starts with, the retrieval, the stripping, the ICSI, and then the choice of culture medium. Of course, we know most of us now have single-step media. Then you can rely on what is your preferred culture system. Are you preferring big volume? Do you prefer group culture, single culture? So there's a lot of different factors that can contribute to that particular stage we finally freeze. Because this is important, right? We just focus on the thawing and transfer of the blastocysts, but to get there and to make them is also an important step. But I'm here to talk about primarily for the freezing and warming. So when we started vitrification of blastocysts, our initial protocol was about 11 minutes. We had a very complicated setup. We connected drops just to increase gently the concentration of the equilibration solution, and then we put them in the VS. So when we changed this by, not because when we connected the drops, we were watching the embryo. Every time you increase the concentration of the cryoprotectant, what happens, the embryo will shrink. But a certain time of the invert solution, it will re-expand. And then, that was a sign for you to move on to the next drop to shrink it again. Just, to get that benefit of dehydration, right? You want to remove as much you can water. Not entirely everything, because there is residue water that will stay in the cell. When we did this procedure, it was very user depending, because you need experienced people. They make a decision, okay, now the cell is shrinking, let's wait, it's re-expanding, then we move on to the next drop and disconnecting. So we simplified that by putting them in one drop, right? Putting them in one drop, let them sink to the bottom of the dish and wait. Just put your clock on. That was the first simplification of each drop. It's important to make it more user-friendly, to take variations out based on the user. So now when you get a protocol that is so simple that 10 people can do it, but it's so simple there is no space for making changes, this is the key of a protocol. And so after that, we went down, to now our protocol for blastocysts is maybe not as short as people expect, but we need a total of 5 minutes. We expose them for 4 minutes to the first step. And most people, if they don't know about cryopreservation, when we expose embryos to the cryoprotectant, we usually use 2 different concentrations of cryoprotectant, and we use usually a combination of 2 cryoprotectant. It could be ethylene glycol and DMSO. Some people replace the DMSO with propandiol, but the key is having 2 cryoprotectant and then add a concentration usually about 7 to 8%. That's the first step, right? And then after a certain time, you expose them, you increase the concentration of the second cryoprotectant solution, again 2 cryoprotectant, but now their concentration is doubled. So in the first solution, if you have like 2 cryoprotectant with each about 7.5%, your solution has 15%, because both bringing together 7.5, that adds up to 15. And your final step, where you only incubate for like not more than 90 seconds, usually 60 seconds, has then 30%, because you increase each concentration of each cryoprotectant to 15%, that adds up to 30%. So this is the most common way at the moment how most oocytes or embryos will be frozen. And so we do 4 minutes in the first solution. And then we don't do anything. We just put them on top of the drop. And usually because of the water loss, the embryo will sink in a certain time and will reach the bottom of the dish. And after 4 minutes, we take the embryo and expose them to 1 minute in the next solution. As I mentioned before, has a concentration twice times higher, 30% in total. And then they will be vitrified. And we use a system, for the vitrification, you need special carriers. because it's important to vitrify them in a small volume, right? It's also very different to slow freezing, where embryos were frozen in straws or even in vials, where you usually found like 0.5 milliliter media. Now we talk about a volume where the embryos will be frozen of less than a microliter, right? Definitely more closer to 0.5 microliter. And that is for a couple of reasons. It has to do with cooling rate, but also warming rate. So we had to find special carriers for performing vitrification. They are now commercially available. There is a different number of carriers available at your choice. We picked one in 2006. It's a closed system, and we call it a closed system because there is no direct contact with the liquid nitrogen. Because when you load the embryos, you put them in another straw, you seal that straw with a heat sealing, and then you plunge it, right? There is no direct contact. And there is a good reason why we do that, because there were publications out there. It was never reported in humans, but it was done on an experimental design that a virus can survive in liquid nitrogen and actually can travel from cells to cells. That means if you store infected and non-infected material together, there is a potential risk that embryos may have that virus, that the virus can travel through liquid nitrogen to the embryos where were not infected. We will not have these scenarios in any IVF lab because of very strict policies how we store embryos from patients if they have infectious disease or non-infectious disease. So we have designated tanks for patients. They had previous contact with HIV, for example, or Hep C or Hep B, and then these embryos will be stored different from patients. They are free of every infectious disease. That's why we know we're running infectious disease control on every patient, and that panel is actually more expanded to donors, third party.
Very interesting. Can you please confirm or maybe elaborate on whether you use the same protocol and medium for both eggs and embryos?
We don't. So as I mentioned, for the embryos, we do 4 minutes and 1 minute, so a total of 5 for vitrification. For oocytes, the traditional protocol is different. It's a much longer exposure time. The reason for this, and we were believing that for many years, there is a different cell size, right? If you look at an oocyte, which is one cell with a huge cytoplasma, there is a different ratio of volume to surface. When you move on to a cleavage stage embryos, with one piece of cytoplasma already cleaved now in 8 smaller ones, right? So your size of cells is shrinking. That means the water content will be less, even if they have the same percentage, but they are easier to dehydrate. So now you move on to the blastocyst, where you usually see like 120 to 150 cells of trophoblast and about 40 of ICM. This cell size is much smaller. So there is a more positive surface to ratio for these blastocyst cells because of their size, that they dehydrate faster. So that means, they need less time to remove the water out of these smaller cells than out of a large oocyte. We know today that is history, right? We know now we can actually expose X to a much shorter time, and we get a sufficient dehydration. That means we have so much water removed that we can make sure when we vitrify, we don't get any intracellular ice crystals, because this is the most important thing. Water is the most essential thing for every living cell, right? It guarantees metabolism, functionality, whatever you need to make that cell something moving on in development. Water is essential. But when we do cryopreservation, this part we have to control. We actually have to take control on this part in terms of reducing the amount of water out of the cell to have less water replaced with the cryoprotectant. And the purpose is to prevent that bridges will be built between ice crystals that would lead to ice between the water molecules that would lead to ice crystals. So we remove the water to so much extent that this ability of bridges between water molecules will not exist, because in between is too many cryoprotectant where will prevent ice crystals. And ice crystals would be devastating for every living cell. They will not survive this. And when you would compare, how slow frozen embryos would look like intracellular to vitrified. There is there is definitely ice crystals intracellular, but you control this growth of ice crystals when you freeze slow by procedure. It's called seeding, right? So this is a slow growth of ice crystals, so they are less harmful. For vitrification, you will have a called glassy vitrified state, right? So your fluid in the cell is like a morph, but it's not created by ice crystals. It's created by an elevation in the viscosity, and finally you get a glassy vitrified state that is free of ice crystals. And that's why, for so many years now, vitrification is successful. It survived slow freezing. I think slow freezing has literally in human IVF no meaning anymore, maybe still somewhere in the animal industry. And for ovarian tissue, there is still, more to develop to move on to vitrification. Slow freezing is still, I think, a technique to cryopreserve ovarian tissue at the moment. But overall, vitrification succeeded, and that was a systematic pathway of research, publications, research. When long-term follow-up studies by Nicole Noyes in 2016, she showed that babies born from vitrified oocytes are not different in terms of the risk of having malformation compared to slow frozen oocytes. So all these studies, they needed time to perform. They were always only able to perform at a certain time. You cannot make studies on babies born after 2 years of implementing this protocol. Sometimes there is a gray period, right? But if we want to deliver something, we have to start at some point. We cannot just demand what's the long-term effect if we don't have pre-existing data before, right? And so, I mean, under well-controlled studies, and so we saw how vitrification improved in many ways, and so it succeeded and replaced slow freezing, I think 200%.
To confirm, the method of vitrification for eggs and embryos differs in timing, in how much time these gametes or embryos spend in a vitrification medium, but the vitrification components of the medium are the same.
That is correct. Vitrification, so we use the same solutions for eggs and oocytes, the same concentrations, even the same setup in terms of maybe drop size. But you're right. But I think, when we would have that talk in, I would say, end of this year, we would not see any more difference in terms of time. Because, we see now new developments, what we already implemented in blastocysts, freezing environment, which will also come to oocytes. There is a clear tendency that shows that oocytes can be vitrified as fast as blastocysts, even with such bigger volume and not favorable surface to ratio volume to surface. We know that now oocytes actually are sufficient dehydrated after 1 minute and instead of 15 minutes. And there is a huge important factor because you can cut down the time exposing these oocytes to unphysiological conditions because it has to be done outside of the incubator, right? So outside of the incubator, we don't have our favorite gas concentration. Is it CO2? Is it triple gas, right? So we will have a change in the pH. We get a change or an increase in rust formation. So there's a lot of things they will not necessarily contribute in a positive way. So if we can get a sufficient dehydration of oocytes that ends up also in an excellent survival rate when we thaw them, and we can do that in like not more than 2 minutes, that would be of course in favor of the oocytes because we can cut down all these conditions we did before, like the unphysiological conditions outside the incubator, and that would be beneficial on top of the protocol. So maybe it's a protocol, but there's also other factors we cut out because of the shortening of the protocol that can have a negative impact on the oocyte.
Well, it would be awesome to have this unification of protocols for everything,
Yes.
which is surprising. So you don't think there is any longer really place for a separate vitrification medium for egg vitrification?
No, there is no. And as long as I remember, we used, for example, I don't want to say a name, but we used the same vendor in terms of freezing oocytes and embryos with the same concentrations. So, and I don't think there was many specific oocyte vitrification media. I know there is one vendor who says, or packs up vitrification media for oocytes and one for embryos. I think it went back because of FDA that, it was approved for embryos much earlier than for
Hmm.
oocytes. But,
Hmm.
at the same time, somehow we had to vitrify oocytes and we used it. It was just more or less off label, and you have to make, patients aware of this. But we didn't do any harm because it worked for embryos when it works for oocytes. And FDA is definitely an important part of our life, but sometimes it takes very long to get these solutions approved, as it was also true for carriers, right? Now things are settled and improved, and so you still have this. You're right, there is a label of vitrification for oocytes and embryos, but on the end, what you use for vitrification of oocytes, you can use for the blastocyst because the concentration is the same. It's a little bit different for the warming kit for some vendors because they start with a lower concentration of sucrose or free allose when you thaw your oocyte or your embryo. But yeah, I mean, I did data on at least different stages, German vesicle and M1s, that's immature oocytes because they are still diploid. I did studies on metaphase 2, that's usually the oocytes we like to see after retrieval because they are now haploid, and only at that stage we are able to fertilize when you inject the sperm or do conventional IVF. And then day 3 embryos, so cleavage embryos, and I got a consistency of over 90% for all these different stages in terms of survival. I showed also that immature oocytes after this short exposure and warming too, because my warming is also 2 minutes instead of 9 minutes, that their potential to move on exists because they converted in the culture dish to mature oocytes. So I can tell you that we have a universal protocol for oocytes on the different stages and for cleavage embryos and for zygotes. That would be 2 minutes in terms of freezing and 2 minutes of warming. The 2 minutes don't work for blastocysts, right? The blastocysts need a little bit longer. And there is also a practical reason I tell you why we do 4 minutes, because in this 4 minutes, when you do a patient's biopsy, you actually usually have maybe one, but in many cases you have like 4 embryos per patient. And then this 4 minutes of exposure time per embryo allows you also to start with 4 embryos at the same time without extending, the time too long for the last embryo you put finally in the VS and freeze. If you have a vitrification protocol of 2 minutes, you have to deal with one embryo at a time. And so this is okay, but there is again the drawback in terms of efficiency, right? So, and we felt like 4 minutes, and that was confirmed by other people too, that 4 minutes exposure time to ES is a good time by getting sufficient dehydration, but also making the freezing more efficient because we can start with up to 4 blastocysts at the same time in terms of the setup and the freezing.
Hmm. Okay, very interesting. Thank you. Now, my next question is, have you experienced any surprises, maybe setbacks or some positive surprise while going through the journey of improving the protocol?
Um, so when for the blastocyst, there was no setback. For the oocytes, there was a setback. When I started at the same time in May of 22, I had a setback of like 5, 6 months, right? because I was so focused on the way how we vitrify so eggs now for 20 years. So, that means I was so focusing on using TS at my first solution, right? And whoever throws oocytes knows what happens if you expose oocytes to TS. It's a high concentration of sucrose, 1 molar, and when you expose oocytes to this solution, you expose them to a very high osmolarity. It's about 1200. Yeah, our normal osmolarity in culture is 280. So what happens with oocytes rise up to the surface, right? And if you are not fast enough, not experienced enough, you will have a hard time to find them in that 1 minute. So, and when they get that extreme ghost stage, right, where you think, oh, that's just an empty sonar. No, it's actually an oocyte, but it's so hard to recognize if you don't have enough experience. And so I was working with this 1 minute and 1 minute, but even already with a shorter exposure time to ES, and I didn't have good survival. And one day I was thinking, our vitrification solution, the final one, and we have two, as I mentioned, ES and VS. The final VS also have sucrose in a concentration of 0.5 molar. Every vendor has that, right? And so I was wondering, why we go in 1 molar where we vitrify with 0.5 molar, right? When you go back to slow freezing, that was like a concept. You went in the same solutions, for example, warming, what you use for freezing. You never went in a higher concentration, right? So slow freezing, you had like your final sucrose concentration was 0.3 molar, much lower. And when you started also thawing in 0.3, you didn't go to 1 molar. So I started, let's go in 0.5 molar. And it is it's a different picture. Your oocytes now exposed to about 750 milliosmol. So osmolarity is about 700, not 280, but not 1200. So they don't rise up, right? You put your carrier in, when you have them sitting there on your carrier and you pick them up. So again, this is much more gentle, more simple and easier for people with experience, of course, and when you put them aside. So they don't get that extreme ghost. It makes it much easier in terms of handling, finding them, classifying them. And then after 1 minute, actually, I go in water solution. After 2 minutes, already oocytes sufficient rehydrated, right? So you bring the water back as you removed it before. So if we move on in future to this protocol, that will be a benefit for the oocytes, for their quality. That means in culture they have much higher potential to make good embryos. That's also purpose about. And then, efficiency also. We save also carriers. I was looking into this. The standard way to freeze oocytes is usually 2 per carrier. For embryos, there is 1. For embryos, since 2013, 12, based on ASRM, we transfer single embryos, especially if they are tested. This is guidelines by ASRM, but we follow these guidelines, and when we do transfer of tested embryos, there is always 1. Patients have the authority to change their mind, and they can. We just have to consult them proper what it means if you might experience a twin pregnancy. And since when, we freeze also 1 blastocyst per carrier, but for oocytes we do 2. And the purpose was also, at a certain time to minimize the volume as much as possible to achieve a high cooling rate. But I showed also that, you will be successful with 4 or even 6 oocytes. And, this is a driven force, to make this procedure more efficient in terms of time, but also saving consumables and cryospace. Because, when you would look in our cryo room, when I started with 4 tanks in 2004, now we have 55 tanks. So, this is just a result of, as I mentioned before, that we see an increase in thawing, freezing oocytes and embryos. Like ASRM published these numbers last year, it was actually SART and also CDC, that we see now increase of cycles involving frozen oocytes and embryos up to now 25 to 30%, right? For years, freezing thawing cycles was about 20%. And Escher reported actually last year in Amsterdam that they see about 30% of all IVF cycles now involving frozen oocytes or embryos. This number will go up. As you know, we have a lot of freeze-all cycles. We have definitely less and less stress transfers. So most embryos we transfer today were exposed to liquid nitrogen. So this is definitely the future. And if we see, that we have this increase in this freezing, thawing of oocytes or embryos, we have to look into these protocols. If they are adequate, our time, are they still successful, is a way to make them more efficient, but keeps success and reliability, there is no question. But so there was time to look into this protocol after 20 years. Because, when we started, we didn't have this number of freezing cycles. That was not comparable. We didn't do as many PGDs, and so genetic testing that requires after the biopsy to freeze the embryos. So all this contributes to an enormous increase. And my prediction is, end of this year, we will have, I think, 50% of all cycles will be involving frozen eggs and embryos. And if you look worldwide, we have about 12 to 14 million babies born since the first IVF baby born, and about now 30% of them are babies born from embryos or oocytes that were stored in liquid nitrogen.
Very interesting. You know that some people have reported improvement in survival or maybe development of blastocysts if they collapse them with a laser before vitrification. Would you share this, or you don't believe it's useful?
I think it's very useful. This is something that is not new. If you would go back to publications, and actually I had one with Juergen Liebermann in 2009, where we showed, that assisting collapsing will be helpful for the blastocysts. And there is a couple of reasons why is this. Usually the embryo, when we take it out of the culture and we talk about blastocysts, they are full expanded. They have a huge, big cavity. We call it blastocele. This blastocele is filled with water. So imagine you expose this embryo now to a cryoprotectant. The cryoprotectant will do its work. It will remove the water, right? But to sufficient dehydrate this embryo, you might expose these blastocysts about 10 minutes to the ES. So now think about making a single shot with a laser. And usually, you find a junction between two trophectoderm cells, right? You don't open the sonar. You just make a shot. And that shot is leading to a little leak. Your water will be removed. And when you start the vitrification procedure, you don't have now to dehydrate 100% of water, right? You might have only 50 or 40% remaining because the maturity of water you were releasing or helping the embryo to release because of the collapsing. And so, when you have that in terms of 100% water removing, now 40%, that allows you to cut the time for the exposure time to ES, equilibration solution. Mm-hmm. As I pointed out, everything is important. Everything we do outside the incubator is time sensitive because, we don't have these conditions where embryo like to be, that is inside the incubator. But we cannot vitrify inside the incubator, right? So when we bring that out in the lab, and we don't have IVF labs, they have 37 degrees Celsius, right? And we don't have 7% or 8% CO2. We have only 0.003%. So all these, we don't have 20%, we have 20% in air, but we usually culture with 5%. So these conditions we expose now with embryo up to 5 days of culture, they are very different. These embryos have a kind of plasticity, but they also can deal at a certain time just where they not get affected. So if we can cut this time down to a very shorter time, it's definitely beneficial. We achieve the sufficient dehydration. We achieve a sufficient status where we can get a successful vitrification intracellular. And then the exposure time outside the incubator is minimized. So it is just a gain and a win for the embryos and the embryologists.
Okay, thank you. Now, can you comment a little bit on importance of the size of the droplets for
Yes.
vitrification?
Yeah. When I can go back one more time to your questions about a seed bag. I have a seed bag at the moment, and it is an interesting study because, when we do biopsies, we have embryos that come back with no results, right? And so what's the alternative? We will rebiopsy again. That's okay. Besides, we take more embryo out of the embryo, but we have to warm them. We have to vitrify them. And when they will be used later, because they may come back as normal, we will thaw them again. So they were frozen and thawed twice, right? And I, at the moment, work with embryos to see, how is their survival and how is their potential after the warming. And so what I see is that our fast farming does not help them if they were vitrified twice, right? So the survival on these embryos is very poor. So I try to change that protocol. I was thinking, so we need maybe a longer exposure time at vitrification, but also at warming. And so I did just yesterday a different protocol and have to look at these embryos. But this is a minor number of embryos, right? We talk about a very small percentage. The majority of embryos work for that protocol we implemented. But for these particular patients, vitrified twice, warm twice, there is obviously something else we need to do to make sure they survive to a better survival as I see for now. So that was my story to the drawback or setback. Then to the collapsing, I want to add, we also showed when you have a short exposure time because you have less water to remove, it is beneficial for what comes after transfer. So you see improvement in terms of outcome, right? So it is also based on our numbers, that's what we see. Now there's people out there that say, might don't need it, but if you do different solutions, if you do a different exposure time, again, you can expose them to 15 minutes and you might get to the same point, but we do it in 4 minutes. And I explained what's the benefit of the 4 minutes in terms of having them outside the incubator. So now your question you were asking me about drop size. So we increased the drop size a little bit, not much. I know there's some people out there in protocols they deal like with, for example, with warming to 4 and 5 milliliter of media. What I think it's really, really big and not necessary. But for blastocysts, for example, our 4-drop, it's now 400 microliter, right? And for the oocytes, I usually freeze in 250 and 100 microliter drops. So what's the benefit of the drop size? I think, first of all, if your drop is bigger, it brings somehow more pressure in terms of water removing on the embryo, on the oocyte, whatever is sitting in that drop, right? It's just a different specific weight of its drop. And then it also helps, maintaining more stability, right? Especially if you have to warm at 37 degrees, because that's what you should do. It's the most important thing, to farm at 37. You cannot go higher because this is unphysiological, but you have to make sure you have consistent 37. That is a maximum temperature we can use to come from minus 196 nitrogen to a temperature that is allowing us to warm the solution and to bring embryos or oocytes back to life. So for the drop size, I think it's a more stability in terms of temperature, osmolarity, and so on.
So it sounds like what you are saying that the amount of solution, relative amount of solution to the embryo has its own impact independent of the components on the solution and anything else.
Yeah, I don't have now really specific data, right? I don't know. There maybe need some very physical and chemical and whatever studies to make sure. But I feel like more confident by having not 5 milliliter. That sounds like really big, and it's really hard to make. You have to make a dish, right? You cannot make drops
Yeah.
anymore because no drop with 5 milliliter will have a chance to stay as soon as you move it a little inch. But we have to work with drop size. They are easy to put on a culture dish and still are able to allow us to move around. And so we are more in favor of this drop size, but I don't think it's much bigger. Before we worked about with 50 microliter. I know some protocols from some vendors suggested in the days back 20 microliter. I think this is all a little bit too small. I like a little bit a bigger biggest drop size, and so I prefer 100 or 200 for this. For the warming, we definitely want to stick with 400. It's a bigger volume, especially you want to make sure you keep your 37. I think a bigger drop holds it longer. As least when I made measurements with a thermostat. You see that your drop size really depends how fast your temperature will drop. And if you have this drop outside the incubator, even on a heating stage, your temperature will not stay at 37, right? There is no way. But it doesn't matter if it drops to 35, because as soon you plunge it, it will have 37. But after 1 minute of 37, and you're done already, because the purpose is of melting that solution, you can go to 35. It doesn't affect the embryo, right? But you have to make sure you have this temperature. There's a couple of things I tried out. They are, for example, we do now 1 minute in TS. There is a dogma for many years in cryobiology, and this is not mean in a negative way, right? When I use the word dogma, but when you fought embryos, you had to go to certain solutions. We call it like a stepwise dehydration, right? You started with a higher concentration of sucrose, and then you reduce the sucrose. And you have to reduce the sucrose because the sucrose is actually a very important, good part of the thawing, because it helps to control the water influx. Because, osmolarity or osmosis, the desire of water is to make an equilibrium. And when you have an oocyte or an embryo want to thaw, there is literally no water inside because you removed it, right? And now you expose it to water, and water doesn't care about survival. It will just do one thing, and it follows with osmosis. It will balance the water inside and outside, so that we have the same osmolarity, right? Intracellular and outer cellular, and we call it isotonic or equilibrium. And if you don't control this, so water do its purpose, and it will lead to the death of the egg or embryo. So sucrose helps us because of its size. It's like a barrier. It controls the water influx. And as long you have a high sucrose concentration, so water can only partially enter the oocyte. That's why we have to reduce the sucrose. When we reduce the sucrose, with every step you reduce the sucrose, water gets more permission to enter the cell. But now we have a more controlled, gentle way, and when it doesn't lead to a burst of the oocyte, you will have actually a survival of the oocyte, right? So sucrose is very important, but as long you expose them to sucrose, they never will expand, right? So, but now we're coming to a step where we're saying, we don't need actually all these different sucrose concentration. We can do it in one. We would also not save just consumables. That's an important factor. We would save media. Again, we would save time. Time for the embryologist performing the procedure, but also time by having that embryo exposed to unphysiological conditions outside the incubator. So we have to bring the water back as soon as possible to reactivate functionality. But when we put them also back to the incubator, where they have the right pH, the right osmolarity, and the right temperature, that all contributes to a healthy growth and coming back to life and making embryos, potentially to implant and making babies.
All right. I would like to bring you back to your experiments on revitrification of embryos. Your results were probably as shocking to you, as shocking to many people who read your post on LinkedIn. I don't know if you published this yet, but when I saw this, it grabbed my attention because this was something very important. And to me, it was important not only because of re-vitrification itself. As you said, it's a very small percentage of embryos which will be revitrified because there is no PGS results available. For me, it was more worrying in a broad sense because when you thaw the embryo, it looked perfectly survived, 100%. That's why you were able to biopsy it. And the question then becomes that when you look at the embryo, which was brought up after vitrification or egg, and it looks perfectly normal, which we record as 100% survival. Is this always true? Isn't the possibility that something happened to these embryos, some of them, which we cannot possibly evaluate by looking at them, but nevertheless, there is some change which has been irreversible, which will not only affect their revitrification, but also affect their development.
This is an excellent question, Dmitry, and you're absolutely right. Looking at the embryo and consider them as survival, it's definitely a tool to make an assessment, but there is a lot of things we might don't see. And I didn't publish this on the revitrification. Other things were published on blastocysts and oocytes. So papers are available for people to look into, to read it, and to studying their own validation and experiments. But for that scenario, which was just mentioned, it is very important that we have to have some unknown, right? An embryo with 120 cells, I would say this is easy to miss 10 cells, they got lost. We wouldn't see that. There is a nice study from Belgium, and they stained these embryos, and they found that actually in only 30% of embryos after warming is 100% survival of cells. 50% of these embryos had about 10 or less cells lost. And when you come to the next 50% in between, 20% would be left. There was like 9%. They had like more than 10 cells, and really a minority, maybe one or two, they died. And you would make a difference. You can see that, right? If an embryo died, there is no re-expansion. You see that in how they change their cell structure. This is obviously. But now having an embryo who has a partial survival, and we talk about like 10 or less cells, we will not see that. The question is, how much does it affect the embryo and its potential to implant? I don't think when we consider this 50% they have 10 or less, it does not. Because the embryo is like after thawing, growing so fast. Just picture an embryo on day 5 in the early morning. You would consider an early blastocyst, and you go back like 3 hours later, and you have a chance to have a fully expanded blastocyst. So in this stage of development, these embryos extremely fast growing, and so after warming, if you do it right, this loss, I would say, of 10% or 10 cells will be overcome in a very short time, and it does not affect the embryo, especially if we talk about trophectoderm cells. I'm not sure about ACM, but it's usually more the trophectoderm cells they might get compromised. But we have an assessment. When we do the transfer, we take pictures for patients. So we see over years you learn how an embryo has to be, especially when we thaw them. There's not an immediate transfer. We have sometimes 1, 2, or 3 hours. So you will see, is a response of these embryos in this 3-hour window between warming and transfer. And when they come back to life, they will re-expand. They might start hatching, and when this embryo took on his ability to move on and have a good potential to create a pregnancy after transfer.
Well, granted this, we usually transfer embryos soon after thawing, so there is no really possibility to follow them up and see what happens. Do you think there is a legitimate concern that perhaps there is some damage which can't be even ascribed to damaged cells, which simply cannot be discerned by even finding those cells? Some other type of irreversible change, which cannot be assessed unless you do some, I guess, biochemical analysis, which we can't even do on the embryo.
Yeah, I'm sure there is something unknown, even after so many years of IVF. But I mean, you have to focus on, we want to make it for every patient, right? But when you see, that the mature embryos do well, and we now really have an outcome using frozen embryos that is comparable to fresh, right? I just looked at our outcome of single embryos where we transfer fresh day 5, and when I compare that to our outcome of frozen and vitrified warmed blastocysts, it is so comparable and so consistent. So over years, we really made it possible. And for people they are not in that field, they have to understand what we have to do to allow embryos to come out of liquid nitrogen to be surviving and regaining activity. So there is some very special science behind, and years of studying in all kind of sectors. Is it bovine? Is it stem cells and all that stuff? So there is a huge community working on this, and as a result, now we have protocols. They are so efficient, but also successful. So there's a contribution of a lot of people. Cryopreservation goes back to the early 50s in the United States with Polish, with sperm, with Stan Lipo, who with David Whittingham and Peter Masur published in 1972 the first successful slow freezing of mouse embryos. And then finally, the landmark paper by Rall and Fay in 1985, where they showed we can also vitrify mouse embryos successfully. And since then, it still took like for human IVF from 85 to, I would say, 99, so more than 10 years, that we adapted it, right? So you see, human IVF is very careful, and that's okay. But there is at a certain time, we come to a point where I think even we try to push it back, it will come back and will us push. Think about me. Maybe I'm the choice, and maybe you have to maybe tweak me a little bit, and then it will be more successful than anything you cryopreserved before. And that happens in UV IVF. This is a very precious material we work with. It is very important for a lot of people. We have a very responsible task to a lot of people out there. They entrusted us with the work and with family building, and that's where we have to be also responsible and have to show that every day in our job.
Now, based on what you said, and I agree that we have very high success rate with frozen transfers, and actually it's better than with fresh transfers. Maybe the results with revitrification, which are limited results really, are the result or reflection of not giving enough time to the embryo to recuperate. Maybe if it would not be just 1 hour between thawing and revitrification, but let's say 5 or 6 hours, it would improve the results. Is it a possibility?
Yeah, so this is, so I know what I did, for example, when we talk about these embryos where were vitrified twice and warmed, first of all, I kept them for 24 hours, right? For 24 hours, they looked awesome. They looked fine. But when you get a problem, right? Because now they are full expanded, and then you have to maybe use a laser. So, you do certain things you might want to prevent. So I did 24 hours and the survival was not good, right? Then the next step was, don't let them grow so fast. Like just after 3 hours or maybe like 2 hours, they still coming back to life. They starting to make a cavity, so we're definitely alive. Re-vitrify them again. So don't let them grow too much because you have to deal with that water. As bigger they get, as longer they culture, they get more water, right? So we cut it down the time. That was also not the solution. So there is still something else. These embryos look fine in the warming solutions. And when we go in the medium, they get these bubbles, and somebody who cryopreserved oocytes or embryos, when you see like these clear bubbles outside, there is something they cannot deal with. Is it sufficient release of the cryoprotectant? and water consumption. And so we have to try. I will do more stuff to expand the time in terms of environment. So I did actually um uh, I fought them much longer, not just 1 minute. I went in different solutions because I thought it's maybe it's a thing they don't like, and it didn't really improve. But I have to go back to my incubator day and I have to look at this. I did that yesterday, and I have to see how they look today. But I still think there is a different trouble. I remember, in the past when we had eggs like this, when we fought them and they showed these bubbles, there's a matter of time they don't survive. This is usually related to the cryopreservation. So we actually exposed them much longer. We did not 4 minutes, we did 6 minutes, but maybe they need even longer, right? These special embryos we talk about, and a minority of, and many of us maybe never have to deal with these embryos, to be honest, because there's very, very few patients. They only rely on this one embryo. They usually have more embryos in culture. They have more embryos. They come back normal and in storage. So before we might get to this one embryo that was rebiopsied twice, and then it has to come back normal, we have many other options to choose from to transfer before we get to these embryos, right? So we talk about a minority of embryos. It's maybe less than 5%, maybe even less than 2%. But it's just a research study to see, because when we follow them, when we have a chance, as I mentioned before, in maybe 1 out of 100 transfers, we might have one embryo that was under these conditions, cryopreserved and warmed twice. We don't get enough data, right? And then because we get 99% survival and 80% pregnant, this one embryo, we think it is just related to the patient and not maybe it's an embryo. So it's hard to get this number because in terms of outcome, because there's very few transfers where we'll have these embryos finally as a final option.
Well, granted that it is a small percentage of embryos, but in medicine, everything begins with one.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
it's just very interesting observation. I thought it's remarkably interesting. And now, as you clarified for me that there was 24 hours period,
Yes,
my first thought was maybe, you know, there's a limit of how long embryos can stay in culture. And this extra date was just too much for them, like pushing the limit of how
yes.
long they can survive. And so it would be really interesting to see it for in the future, I guess, if it's possible, to discern whether what you observe, this bubbling, as you described, is a memory of an embryo because of previous vitrification, or perhaps is simply reaching a limit of its viability in vitro, which creates this phenomenon. Would it be fair to ask?
Yeah, that's it. That's a possibility. That's actually a good idea. To read this like this, what you just try to define. That is definitely a reason. Yeah, and for these embryos, so after I did 6 hours and I did 3 hours, and it didn't help me when I warmed them. So I think it is maybe less the time. I don't think we want to let them grow as much as possible. There is no purpose, because when we rebiopsy, they will collapse, and when we will freeze them, usually, when we biopsy embryos, we freeze them in the next 5 minutes. So right after biopsy, they go on the carrier and will be plunged in nitrogen. So we don't allow them anything to come back and grow. Some people do this, but I would not do. Makes no sense to me, right? But we have to see where is a problem. So it is something I will put on my task to look into, to figure out, finding the needle in the haystack.
Well, when you find out, we'll definitely have to invite you back to this podium. And let me ask you this last question. Uh, Based on everything which you created, your new protocols and everything, are we expecting at one moment Liebermann vitrification medium to come into the market?
I this idea passed already. That was like long ago when I started this. but it is just very difficult, right? What I did, I found companies, they took that on and they made their media. But, making my own media, going through the procedure of producing it, going to the FDA, doing, the testing and getting permission to sell it, that would be too much, not just in terms of money, but I think also in stress for one single person. So you will not see a Liebermann media.
Okay, Juergen, thank you so much for coming to this interview. I'm sure that our listeners enjoyed it and learned something important for them. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, and you have a wonderful day, Dmitry.